Unbelievable. Okay. I meant that in a nice way. It's always good to hear you.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's see.
Right.
I'm about to start. Calling to order this hearing. This is a public hearing of the Committee of the Whole of the Council of the District of Columbia. I'm Phil Mendelson, Chairman of the Council and Chair of the Committee of the Whole. Today is Thursday, February 3rd, 2022. The time is 1:41 in the afternoon. The subject of this hearing is Fiscal Year 2021 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. This hearing is being broadcast live via the Zoom video conference broadcast platform. It's also available live on Council Channel 13 cable television. I believe it's also available live on the DC Council website, which is www.dccouncil.us. And it may also be available live on the chairman's website, which is www.chairmanmendelson.com/live. And of course, this hearing is being recorded and will be available on the council's website under the Legislative Information Management System. As I said, the subject of this hearing is the Fiscal Year 2021 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. And the purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from government witnesses, namely the executive, the chief financial officer, and the inspector general regarding the results of the fiscal year 2021 Aquifer. That's the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. By law, the Aquifer must be released by January 31st, 2022. This document and this hearing are important to understand the financial health of the district government. Copies of the Aquifer may be obtained after it is released, which it has been, from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer or the OCFO, Office of Chief Financial Officer website. I believe I said it has to be released by January 31st. I think actually it has to be released by February 1st, and it was released on February 1st. We have on the witness list as well Wayne McConnell, who is the managing partner of McConnell Jones LLP, who did the audit. Today's hearing is a yearly affair whereby the council has officially presented the results of the district's annual audit. What was once known as the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report has been rebranded the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or Aquifer. Following statements by the Inspector General, who is responsible for the audit, who contracts with the independent auditor. Statements from him, the Chief Financial Officer, who is responsible for managing the finances that are being audited, and the City Administrator, who's responsible for spending the finances that are being managed and then audited. There will be at least one 10-minute round each for council members to ask questions. The Aquifer, Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, shows that we had $10.9 billion of general fund revenues and $9.7 billion of general fund expenditures in fiscal year 2021. And the fiscal year, I think we all know this, but just for the public's benefit or the record, the fiscal year ended September 30th, 2021. The difference between the revenues and the expenditures was excess that was added to our general fund balance. And at the end of the fiscal year, the general fund balance was $3.6 billion. The $3.6 billion fund balance is restricted or committed for our federally and locally mandated reserves, plus debt service reserves, plus future budgets, plus special funds. And I said it that way because some folks think, well, we have $3.6 billion in the fund balance. This money is just sloshing around and available for anything and everything. But in fact, it is all accounted for. Again, the federally mandated reserves to locally mandated reserves, the special funds, which are funds such as there are a number of environmental funds, for example, where money is set aside specifically for purposes, environmental purposes, as well as funds required for our debt service and funds that were specifically budgeted to be surplus to be carried forward to the financial plan for expenditures. And I probably just said what I'm going to say in my next bullet here, which is this $3.6 billion fund balance isn't extra money just sitting around. Rather, these funds are either one, restricted, such as $412.8 million for bond escrows to support our $13 billion debt. Second, committed, such as the $645 million being reserved for future budgets, or the $198 million tied to specific revenues, the latter of which includes funds at the Department of Energy and Environment for environmental programs and the Office of Unified Communications to support the E911 call center. And third, funds otherwise assigned for uses by the council, the mayor, or the OCFO. Some might say, well, the general fund balance may be spoken for, but within the fund balance are the federally and locally mandated reserve funds. That's $1.53 billion, or 43% of the general fund balance. Surely some of these rainy day funds can be used because if not now, in this time of hardship, then when? Actually, 3 of the 4 rainy day funds have been used extensively over the past 2 years. The $226 million fiscal stabilization reserve was used to fund programs and services that would have otherwise been cut in fiscal year 21. The $828 million cash flow reserve is used to manage cash flow to avoid short-term borrowing called tax revenue anticipation notes, which we used to do on an annual basis and then pay interest on. The $317 million contingency reserve is used to meet one-time unexpected expenses such as those related to the current public health emergency. By having robust rainy day funds and being able to rely on them when our revenues took a nosedive, the district was able to weather the pandemic without having to resort to cutting vital programs and services. The fiscal year 21, in fiscal year 2021, the 1.6% of the general fund budget, let me start over. In fiscal year 2021, 1.6% of the general fund budget went unspent. That's about $151 million. That's about $151 million out of, I think it's 9.7 billion or 10 billion. The revenues came in better than projected despite the recession, leading to a large budgetary surplus. I understand that it is difficult to project revenues during this unprecedented pandemic, but this is the second year in a row where the district is experiencing year-end $500 million windfalls. These unanticipated windfalls, as opposed to more accurate revenue estimates throughout the fiscal year, make it more difficult for the council to invest in long-term transformational investments when we have the budget before us. I could put that a little differently. It's a general principle with regard to municipal finances that you want to spend money, not just leave it sitting around. And surplus is money that was sitting around. And it would have been better if the revenue estimates had been either revised more frequently so that it could be budgeted, or had been estimated more accurately so it could be budgeted. The annual comprehensive financial report identifies a large budgetary surplus. However, after all unexpended funds were allocated between the various funds within the general fund balance, and $387 million of the fiscal year 21 funds were moved forward and appropriated in the fiscal year 22 budget, the district was left with a net surplus of about $566.4 million. By law, surpluses automatically go 50% to the Housing Production Trust Fund and 50% to the Capital Fund for infrastructure needs. This money is available for new programs only if we redirect it. And we have chosen to redirect these funds in the past 2 years. I believe that these one-time windfalls, plus perhaps more importantly, our long-term revenue growth, should prioritize education and increase equity for all students, and also be invested in long-term, committed to long-term investments that will have a significant return or benefit to the district. This is the 7th year in a row. No material weaknesses or significant deficiencies were found in the district's internal financial controls, and I think we'll hear that repeated by each of the witnesses. This assures us that the financial statements are reliable. In this regard, I commend Fitzroy Lee and his predecessor, Jeff DeWitt, and Kevin Donahue, and their teams for the clean audit, which is a testament to the excellence of their financial stewardship. This is the first year that the management letters that identified deficiencies in internal controls were issued at the same time as the Aquifer's release. While the management letters identified deficiencies that are much less worrisome than material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, they are useful to help the council to identify areas where we should focus our oversight. The agencies that have reported deficiencies in internal controls are the Government of the District of Columbia 401A plan, the District of Columbia Retirement Board, which I believe there are 2 internal deficiencies, the Department of Employment Services, the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, the University of the District of Columbia, the Department of General Services, and the Department of Employment Services. I already mentioned them twice. In closing, I would like to thank our Chief Financial Officer, Fitzroy Lee, our Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Controller, Kimberly Williams, Inspector General Daniel Lucas, all of their staffs, and our auditors, McConnell and Jones, for their work on the Aquifer. And thank them as well that it was timely this year, which is required by law. With that, let me turn to colleagues in the order in which they arrived. Councilmember Nadeau, if you have a statement.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I do. Just a moment. I want to thank CFO Lee, City Administrator Donahue, Inspector General Lucas, and Mr. McConnell for briefing the council today on the annual comprehensive financial report and for making themselves available for our questions. And I would also like to congratulate everyone on the 25th consecutive clean audit. In the past couple of years, the district and our residents have faced new and unfamiliar challenges. We've experienced a virus that caused a direct negative impact on our community's medical health and economic health. We've learned that these challenges were not a blip on the radar, but instead an inflection point for our community to learn, grow, and change what we understood to be business as usual. What we once considered normal is no longer before us, and we find ourselves navigating an ever-changing new normal. We in government have established relief efforts to support our community through these times and made changes to how we operate to better serve our residents. Integral to the relief and support provided is and continues to be the work done by your respective teams in ensuring the strong financial health of the district. It's impressive that the district was able to withstand our yearly financial audit once again and for the 25th consecutive year, no findings of material weakness or significant deficiencies. While the district's financial health appears to be in order, we must not forget that there remain members of our community who felt the impact of the pandemic and continue to feel left behind. While the unemployment rates appear to be declining, this is not the case for the leisure and hospitality sector, one of the most important parts of our economy. Employment in the leisure and hospitality sectors remain below pre-pandemic levels, and the negative impact on the pandemic on business activity persists. We continue to see an outsized demand for emergency rental assistance for residents who have fallen behind on making rent. It's critical that we continue to monitor the rental and housing market and develop and fund the appropriate solutions to ensure that we do not leave residents behind as we move towards economic prosperity. I'd also like to echo the chairman's concern about the need for increased funding for our schools. The pandemic has taken a toll on our schools, and it's important that we are providing a safe and comfortable space for our young learners. As a government, we will continue to think creatively and lean on your financial expertise as we navigate our way through ever-changing new normal. Congratulations again, and I look forward to hearing the testimony.
Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau. Councilmember Pinto.
Thank you very much, Chair Mendelson, for hosting this meeting today, and thank you to Acting CFO Lee, Inspector General Lucas, the entire staff in the office, CFO and the Office of Inspector General, as well as the audit teams at McConnell and Jones, Regis and Associates, and the WORS Group. I know this report is a huge undertaking every year, and I'm very grateful to all of you for your time and expertise to ensure the continued financial health of the district. The immense challenges we face as a city, particularly after these last 2 years of the pandemic, are evident throughout this report. The report highlights our heightened expenditures last year on critical forms of COVID relief, including unemployment, support for unhoused residents, rental assistance, and our bridge funds. We see the ways in which the pandemic has changed how we live and work, with changes in home buying trends and still too many of our residents unemployed and unhoused. And in the midst of these challenges, we are reminded that we face substantial income inequality in the district. We saw wage growth increase last year, driven largely by salary growth for professional and managerial workers. Meanwhile, nearly 15% of our residents are living in poverty, and our middle class is dwindling, as many are priced out of opportunity here. While we were able to mitigate some of the challenges facing district residents, we still have a lot of work to do. For instance, we know that undocumented workers, cash economy workers, and returning citizens were systematically excluded from federal relief efforts. We need to continue to right that wrong by providing more support for our excluded workers. And we have many other pressing needs that need to be addressed this year, including COVID mitigation and protection, keeping our teachers and kids safely in school, supporting our small businesses, and ensuring our unhoused neighbors have opportunities to move into secure housing, especially during these freezing months. And we know that we have so many residents who are still struggling to pay their rent. While we work to solve these immediate challenges, we also have a responsibility to maintain the district's long-term strategy for remaining solvent and maintaining our economy as we look to recovery and growth. One key component of this strategy is through maintaining our reserve funds. So I'm curious today to learn about the health of our reserve funds and how impacted they were throughout the last year as we plan for the years ahead. And I look forward to exploring how to maintain the district's long-term position of financial security while also investing in our residents' immediate needs. So thank you again, Mayor Bowser, CFO Lee, and to our independent audit team. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Henderson, you'll be followed by Councilmember Silverman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm looking forward to the discussion today on the FY21 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. Last year at this hearing, I spoke about the uneven impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I feel that the Aquifer continues to illustrate the uneven economic fallout and recovery. Our housing market continues to be strong. Mr. Chairman.
Please continue. There's
Okay.
background noise that you're picking up, and I apologize.
Okay. Our housing market continues to be strong and somewhat divorced from the rest of the economy. However, if you're not lucky enough to own your own home, or if you're a worker, and as I'd already mentioned in the hospitality industry, you're likely not benefiting from the full recovery. So I'm interested in learning more about how the pandemic has impacted our revenue estimates, why we handle some of our finances the way we do, and some deeper analysis into some of our clusters in terms of the expenditures and not. I would like to acknowledge the gravity of what we're talking about today. This is the 25th consecutive clean audit and the 7th year of no material weaknesses or deficiencies in our finances. All those associated with the smooth operation of our government and its finances should be acknowledged and praised for such a strong financial position and an incredible bond rating after what has been a volatile couple of years. This hearing will provide insights and help frame the remainder of our performance oversight hearings, as well as our budget hearings for the upcoming FY22 supplemental and the FY23 budgets. And so I want to say thank you in advance to our witnesses, and I look forward to a healthy discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Henderson. I apologize for that noise. Councilmember Silverman, followed by Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello to colleagues, and welcome to our highly distinguished panel of witnesses. Congratulations again. Okay, here we are again. We have a new year-end financial report telling us we have lots of money, including accounts flush with hundreds of millions of dollars. That's good news, no doubt. I think we have to acknowledge that it can be a bit frustrating for our residents and our businesses to see this big surplus. Because as you acknowledge, Mr. Chairman, we've had tens of thousands of workers file for unemployment over the last 2 years, businesses that have either closed or are struggling to pay their rent, particularly as Councilmember Nadeau said, in one of our biggest drivers of our economy, the hospitality industry. And I hear you, Mr. Chairman, that various fund balances were filled and used. And again, that's good. But I agree wholeheartedly with you that we need to more accurately and fine tune our revenue estimates so we can deploy monies urgently and not wait until like 5 months after the fiscal year ends to spend it on things that we know we need and our residents and businesses need. But I want to see the glass half full here. So, I think this means as policymakers, we have not only an opportunity, but an obligation to match resources with our shared priorities, to help workers, to help struggling renters, be they families or small businesses in commercial buildings, or honestly, their landlords, to help our students and teachers, as you said, Mr. Chairman, our hospitality industry survive this pandemic and set us up for the future. I will just say, if there's one thing the pandemic it's taught me, is that we have to adjust. We have to be nimble. We have to be resilient, as the Aquifer is indeed titled this year. And so I am interested in exploring ways we can make those adjustments as a government to make sure that there is the money in place to really address the challenges that our residents and our businesses are telling us they need help with. So as a preview to the witnesses in my questions, Mr. Chairman, I will be focusing on how we can deploy those dollars identified in these financial statements to address, as you said, Mr. Chairman, our schools, making sure they're safe, making sure we're addressing the mental health needs of our kids who have endured a lot in this pandemic, like all of us. I'm going to focus on affordable housing and whether we're optimally deploying our housing dollars. I want to make sure in perhaps the second round, but maybe in the first, that we have an unemployment insurance fund that is ready for the next time we face some kind of downturn, and a paid leave system that really does truly meet the needs, not only of our workers, but of their employers. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. Councilmember McDuffie, followed by Councilmember Che.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good afternoon to my colleagues. I want to also welcome Dr. Lee, the Acting Chief Financial Officer, Inspector General Lucas, and City Administrator Donahue to today's hearing. We all should take pride in the fact that this is the 25th consecutive clean audit of the district's finances. A clean audit opinion with no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies for 7 consecutive years demonstrates sound financial management and accounting practices. The district also retained its high bond rate that I know we're all proud of, and it allows us to help access the market and issue bonds at very low rates to maximize investments in things like economic development, and added $283.2 million, as just mentioned, each to the Housing Production Trust Fund and the Capital Fund, or PAYGO, as we call it. Despite the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, the district's economy is still strong. Our federally, locally mandated reserves are fully funded to provide 60 days of operating costs, totaling about $1.5 billion at the end of fiscal year 21. Revenue's growing, employment numbers have increased, and unemployment claims have fallen. Even sales tax revenue, though significantly below pre-pandemic levels, it recovered better than we anticipated. In fact, according to the Aquifer, fiscal year 21 local revenues even surpassed FY19 pre-pandemic. So while I'm pleased with the district's financial health, I think what's quite clear, and you've heard it in my colleagues' statements, is that we've got quite a way to go. Despite the positives, the Aquifer also identified inequities, significant inequities in the district's financial recovery. The hospitality and tourism sectors continue to suffer, as a number of small businesses across the District of Columbia. And residents and workers continue to struggle to pay for rent and utilities. Further, according to the Aquifer, income distribution in the district is very polarized, with most people falling either at the high or low income brackets. Very few in the middle. And it's my hope and expectation that we can use this information and work together collaboratively to ensure that the district's financial health better translates into broader economic opportunity and security for the district's residents, its workers, and small businesses. And this requires intentional targeted investments across the board, but historically disenfranchised communities, Black and Brown communities. Today and over the course of our oversight season, I'm going to continue to plan to explore how the district's efforts, namely through its budget process, have advanced racial equity. What we should keep doing, but also what we should stop doing, frankly, to ensure that all the district's residents benefit from our shared prosperity. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. I look forward to the conversation today, and I'll be in and out with the panels. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember McDuffie. Councilmember Che, followed by Councilmember Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Mendelson, for having this hearing. As always, I want to congratulate the mayor and Mr. DeWitt on a clean audit, this being the district's 25th in a row. And good afternoon to all of our witnesses, to CFO Lee, City Administrator Donahue, and our Inspector General Lucas. And I'm pleased to see that this year's annual comprehensive financial report relates that we're in a very strong position to recover from the effects of the pandemic. And that said, we continue to see the long-term effects of the pandemic on certain commercial sectors such as retail and hospitality, as well as commercial real estate. The experience of residents as represented by the data in this report underscores the continued importance of the many relief programs and protections that we provided to residents during the pandemic, and the urgency of standing back up the Stay DC program as soon as possible. In addition to items already mentioned by my colleagues, and given the trends in both 2020 and 21, one question we need to address, I think, is the degree to which any of these trends will be permanent. For example, is it likely that we're finally able to put the pandemic behind us, but will most or some, many of our employers continue to allow their employees to work remotely? Now, employees can wind up being rather productive in that circumstance, but there may be a continued downward trend or pressure on our sales taxes from employees who would come into the district. Employers are seeing a real cost savings at the same time by not having to lease space and maintain in-office office space. The data underscores this fact. There's a vacancy rate in leased properties. It's 14.9% in 21. Where that trend continues, as I imagine it may, it's essential that we not just plan, but we have to start taking decisive action to ensure that businesses, building owners, and commercial corridors can weather the changes. For one, it's going to require a rethinking, a major, large-scale rethinking of the downtown and other commercial areas that are light in housing. And so we need to have a plan. Separately, yet again, we ended the fiscal year with a tremendous surplus, $560 million, $110 million of which is agency underspending, with the remaining $450 million coming from higher than anticipated revenues. In 2020, we also ended the year with a large surplus, then more than $550 million. The district is in such a strong financial position that it's great news. But taken together during the pandemic, we've seen over $1 billion in surplus. Only about a quarter of that is from agency underspending. The vast majority of it is from revenues not anticipated in the estimates. Now, the fact that we continue to see these large surpluses is concerning because every year, and my colleagues know this, we scour the budget to look for funding to support essential services and programs, to fund legislation that we've passed, and we come up short. Let me just give you a few examples. Available funding for Vision Zero couldn't be funded in 2022. The council was unable to identify funding to implement the 2020 law establishing mold enforcement through DCRA. That would have helped us address some of the causes of the district's staggering asthma rates, which are 50% higher than the national average. We have just one mold inspector for all 8 wards. Another example, these dollars could have gone a long way to last summer and fall to support the currently closed down Stay DC program. And these are just, a few examples of many. And I share this to underscore the fact that the consistent, overly cautious revenue estimates have a tangible and frankly detrimental effect on our ability to fund programs and legislation that are critical actually to the lives of our residents. Now, I always agree, of course, that we should be cautious about our estimates, but you can overdo a thing, and I think that's what's happening here. So in light of these repeated very high surpluses, I think we need to revisit the assumptions that are built into our revenue and spending estimates to ensure that spending is better right-sized to revenue. And there are some other questions, issues raised by my colleagues that I also want to hear about and to deal with the needs that we have unmet and inequities that we see in the district. So I will look forward to our opportunity to hear from our stellar panel and look forward to the discussion today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Che. Councilmember Allen, followed by Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me also add my thanks and congratulations. Feels that's at least the general theme for everybody. So congrats to the mayor's team, the CFO, and everyone involved. The fundamentals show a strong economy and a base for the district. As we continue to recover from the ongoing pandemic, I think that the Aquifer has some promising and at the same time, some heartbreaking numbers. We've all seen our revenue creep back toward pre-pandemic numbers. And in the Aquifer, the CFO attributes much of that growth to the district having more businesses operating in person. Almost every local business that I talk with shares with me how they have struggled these last 2 years, especially our local businesses like your small retailers, your dry cleaners, your restaurants. These local businesses are going to need more support to make an equitable recovery a reality and make sure their doors stay open and those jobs continue to grow. I said at the beginning of this pandemic that one of my biggest fears on the economic front was that national corporations would have the deep pockets and the lines of credit to survive this the best. And we lose our local flavor in the name of chains. This coming year, I think, is one where we've got to focus what tools our local businesses need to recover and thrive rather than be replaced by chains and franchises. And further, as we've talked about during this last year's hearing, the Aquifer shows that incomes continue to rise. We remain a city of haves and have-nots. As the Aquifer reports in FY21, personal income in the district increased by $3.4 billion. And we've known throughout the pandemic that those who already had the highest incomes were the most likely to see an increase, while those with the already lowest incomes were disproportionately impacted by job losses and loss of income. And that bears out in CFO's numbers. The district has a median income more than 30% higher than the rest of the country, while still having a higher percentage of families in poverty than the country at large. That's precisely why I worked with my colleagues to ask those at the very top of the income ladder, just those top 5% of all district residents, to do just a little bit more. Now, one of the programs we were able to fund with that increased revenue was a huge increase in the district's earned income tax credit, which we can then turn into a monthly basic income. This will put an additional $30 million into the pockets of the lowest income workers in the district without increasing their income tax burden or endangering their eligibility for other benefits like TANF and SNAP. Certainly, that benefit is set to begin in the fall as FY23 begins. I hope the mayor will consider using some of the surplus and the increased projected revenue to move forward the implementation date earlier for this hugely important investment. The EITC, just like the child tax credit that has been shown to pull families out of poverty, And with Congress failing to extend the increased child tax credit, the increased local EITC will have an important impact for families locked out of the greater recovery. Another related proposal is my Metro for DC legislation. It would help defray up to $100 of district residents' transportation costs every month. This will help our transit-dependent residents, those essential workers we've talked about for 2 years, keep more money in their pockets for other expenses. These are residents who are disproportionately Black and brown, who are often our frontline workers who cannot work remotely. In addition, it would create a dedicated fund to improve bus service to communities that need and struggle for more equitable WMATA services. And of course, as we've heard from many businesses already, this proposal would greatly help their employees and customers, a direct line to helping our city's economic recovery. As our revenues continue to expand, I hope that I can work with my colleagues and the mayor to fund this important benefit for the district residents, which will have both equity and climate change impacts and will be a support to our regional transit system, which we desperately need to support an equitable recovery. I want to close with echoing the comments that several others have made, namely a frustration that we routinely are seeing budget estimates far off from the final year numbers. While conservative budgeting may have some merits, it also, as said, can be overdone. It also directly restricts the council's ability to make budgetary decisions in the regular course of action to meet our city's needs, to meet our residents' needs, and to build a more equitable budget and recovery. I hope that we can continue working on this and look forward to all the questions and conversation that we're going to have this afternoon. And Mr. Chairman, thanks again for holding today's hearing.
Thank you, Councilmember Allen. Councilmember Robert White, followed by Councilmember Bond. Councilmember Robert White. I mean this with the greatest respect and love, but you look frozen.
Chairman.
You look alive and well.
Yeah, my power went out. But luckily I have a cell phone. Am I up, Chairman?
You are. You shouldn't be blaming us, but please proceed.
Thank you very much. And I will be deliberately brief, but I want to start by thanking Dr. Lee, Inspector General Lucas, and City Administrator Donahue for all of their work on this. And I want to note what my colleagues have noted as well, which is that there are so many strong indicators, strong financial points for the city. They include individual income taxes up 11.2%. Corporate franchise taxes up 16.4%, real property taxes up 2.7%, and deed taxes up 22.3%. So there are some very positive indicators. However, we also have to recognize sort of how uneven the prosperity and success is and what that means for the district in the long term. For instance, unemployment is still high, particularly in Ward 7 and 8, where it is in double digits. The district's poverty rate was last year 14.8% compared to 11.9% nationally. This is in one of the wealthiest cities in the country. And DC has yet again a higher percentage of residents who are high in high income brackets and those in low income brackets than most of the rest of the country. This means that we do not have a strong and sustained middle class. The challenge for us as a council and for the city is to figure out how to use the parts of our economy that are strong to help those parts of the economy and communities that are not as strong. We do have the resources, but we have to do a better job of targeting them where they are needed while keeping our economy running strong. It's something I believe we can do, but we have to be deliberate about it. So I look forward to the hearing. Unfortunately, I'll have to jump in and out because of other meetings, but I am looking forward to this hearing and analysis. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember White. Councilmember Bonds.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for holding today's review of our financial situation. I want to thank our guests for their presentation to come. And I want to thank my colleagues for laying out very broad issues that are before us today. We always like to celebrate the annual financial report, this being our 25th consecutive, no bars opportunity for us to cheer about how extraordinarily successful we have been. And I want to commend the mayor and her team as well. But I do have some concerns about how we not only spend our money, but how we are projecting that we have money to spend. And so I just want to echo that fact again and again. I'm hoping that we can, as you said, Mr. Chairman, you want more accurate forecasting. Perhaps we could have sort of preliminary forecasting on a quarterly basis that would sort of alert us. And then, of course, we as the council probably have to pass some resolution that would give us the authority to utilize some of this money without touching our $3.6 billion of reserves and special funds. But my real concern today is to make sure that I understand that if the income sources that we have and the very fragrant ones, that they relate to the areas of need as we think about how we want to spend this so-called surplus and how we would engage the mayor in doing that. I'm very disappointed whenever I hear about the millions of dollars that the agencies report as underspending. Because as many of my colleagues have pointed out, there are some needs that we could have addressed within the annual year if we had known about it, that we had the money to do that. And when my colleague, Councilman Riche, points out mole, this is a very important area of concern that we have to take a little more seriously. We have to get rid of the mole, and to learn and to tell the public that we have only one mole inspector for the entire city is unconscionable. And so I'm hoping that those kinds of immediate issues can be addressed once we explore with you today the monies that are available. I want to bring down the poverty rate, and that's another area that I think we can begin to use our monies more effectively. And of course, I want to make sure that we're expanding the housing services. And I understand that today I will not get into those details, but I do want the public to understand that the resources that we will be discussing today are resources that can lead us to addressing these issues. And you've heard about how we want to do better by our schools and make sure that the schools are secure and safe for our students and our workers. And so, Mr. Chairman, I won't take too much additional time, but I just wanted to make sure that I'm here to hear a little more about how we can be more effective as a government in understanding what we might have in the way of resources throughout the year, and not just wait to the end of the year and then discover that we have some additional dollars. But congratulations again to those who are the keepers of our dollars. You've done an excellent job, and thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Bonds. We're going to turn to the witnesses, and I was just informed Wayne McConnell, who's one of the witnesses, is in the attendee room and can't, for some reason, we can't let him in to participate. And it may be that he needs to log off and log back on, or it may be that one of the other witnesses, like the Inspector General, might have some secret to how Wayne McConnell can get let in. In any event, we can't let him in, and he's one of the witnesses. He's kind of maybe one of the more important witnesses since he's actually the auditor.
They're working on it, Chairman.
Okay, this is your time of year, so.
Oh, there he is. We work fast.
Yes, we solved the problem. I have no idea if you did anything, but I'll give you credit. All right, so the witnesses are Daniel Lucas, who's the Inspector General, Wayne McConnell, who's the Managing Partner of McConnell Jones, Fitzroy Lee, who's the acting chief financial officer, and Kevin Donahue, who's the city administrator, and you will each speak in that order. Mr. Lucas, you want to begin, and good afternoon.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I'm Daniel W. Lucas, Inspector General for the District of Columbia. I am pleased to appear virtually before the committee to discuss the district's fiscal year 21 annual comprehensive financial report audit results. To assist me in providing the committee with an overview of the FY21 Aquifer audit results are staff from the Office of Inspector General and Wayne McConnell, engagement partner and member of the McConnell-Jones Integrated Audit Team, contracted by the OIG to independently audit the district's financial statements. Before discussing the FY21 Aquifer audit results, it is essential to mention the hard work culminating in today's hearing. Specifically, to ensure an independent and objective financial statement audit of the district, the OIG is statutorily responsible for contracting with an independent auditor who is not an officer or employee of the OIG to audit the complete financial statement and report on the activities of the district government for each fiscal year. In awarding this contract, the OIG must ensure the same independent auditor is not used for more than 5 consecutive years. FY21 is the first option year of the OIG's Aquifer audit contract with McConnell-Jones. In addition to the contract award, the OIG is responsible for day-to-day Aquifer audit contract administration and oversight. The OIG devotes substantial resources throughout the fiscal year to ensure the district's Aquifer audit is delivered on time and comports with applicable standards. Per the contract, the OIG's independent auditors are responsible for issuing an opinion on the district's overall Aquifer, issuing opinions for 10 district organizational units, funds, and programs, and reviewing opinions issued by 7 third-party auditors hired by their respective district organizational units, funds, and programs. One of the OIG's main tools to administer the contract for the audit of the district's financial statements is the Aquifer Audit Oversight Committee. The OIG's Aquifer Committee ensures the Aquifer contract deliverables are within scope, schedule, and budget. The Aquifer Committee meets periodically with the district's independent auditors, the Executive Office of the Mayor, the DC Council, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, and other district management officials. Matters that may impact the Aquifer audit are brought to the committee, which in turn work to remediate any impediments. I want to thank the Aquifer Committee members and their agencies for their cooperation and support in completing the Aquifer audit on time in a remote environment. As reported, this year marks the 25th consecutive year the district has received an unmodified or clean opinion from its independent auditors. Also, this is the 7th consecutive year with no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal control over the district's Aquifer. In addition to delivering an unmodified opinion on the district's overall FY21 Aquifer, we released 17 additional unmodified audit opinions on the financial statements of the district's various component units, funds, and programs. The independent auditors are also required to communicate to management and those charged with governance and other matters related to the district's internal control. For FY21, the independent auditors issued 5 management recommendation reports on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters. The OIG transmitted these management recommendation reports on February 1st, and they are available on our website at oig.gc.gov. District agencies must focus their attention on remediating these internal control deficiencies. It should be noted that several of the findings in the management letter were the subject of previous OIG audit findings. The council needs to be aware of these issues when executing its oversight responsibilities and deliberating the next FY budget, because in some instances, remediation of findings may require additional budget authority. Absent action by the responsible district entities, future district Aquifers could receive a modified audit opinion. which would have adverse consequences on the district's credit rating. Although these findings do not currently have an adverse effect on the district's overall Aquifer opinion, district management attention to these findings is imperative to ensure they do not become larger problems and affect the district's overall financial reporting. Before I ask Mr. McConnell to provide an overview of the FY21 Aquifer audit results, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Aquifer committee members for their dedication in monitoring the Aquifer audit over the last several months, keeping management and others abreast of the status of ongoing work, and assisting the independent auditors in completing the audit on schedule. Further, I must also again acknowledge the cooperation and support district agencies provided to complete the FY21 Aquifer audit in a restricted environment. Finally, I would specifically like to recognize the leadership of Faketi Jindaba, the OIG Aquifer Committee Chair, representatives from the OCFO, and representatives of the Office of the City Administrator for their leadership during the FY21 Aquifer audit. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. McConnell to provide an overview of the FY21 Aquifer audit results.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Before Mr. McConnell speaks, I just want to thank you that we got the management letter simultaneous with the Aquifer itself. That's very helpful.
Yes, sir. That was one of the goals we had. I'm glad we delivered.
Mr. McConnell.
Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you, Inspector General Lucas, for that kind introduction. My name is Wayne McConnell, and I'm a partner and member of the McConnell & Jones fully integrated team that conducted the independent audit of the District of Columbia's annual comprehensive financial report, or ACFR, for the year ended September 30, 2021. My firm, McConnell & Jones, is the independent auditor of record for the ACFR for the year ended September 30, 2021. We would like to thank the chair and council members for allowing our team the opportunity to present our audit results today. Okay. Sharing the screen. Can everyone see the slide deck?
We have the screen. We have the screen.
Okay, very, very good. Thank you. So I'm pleased to report, as we've heard, that we have issued an unmodified opinion or a clean opinion on the district's financial statements. We have also issued unmodified opinions on all 10 standalone entities which we were engaged to audit. We identified no material weaknesses in internal control over financial reporting, no instances of fraud that are material to the financial statements. We proposed no audit adjustments or past audit adjustments on the financial statements. And of course, we received full cooperation from district management during our audit of the district. I mentioned the 10 standalone entities. As you can see on this slide, this is a listing of those 10 standalones that we issued separate opinions on. On the next slide, there are certain other entities which are included in the district's ACFR, which separately engaged auditors to conduct their audits. They're presented on this slide. We conducted certain procedures on the work of these auditors so that we could rely upon their work. On slides 4 and 5, on these two slides, we and the third-party auditors have identified certain internal control deficiencies during the conduct of our audit. These have all been included in either the district's management letter or by the third-party auditors in their Yellow Book audit opinions. There was one verbal recommendation that's shown on this slide relative to a deficiency in internal control. On the next slide, these are a summary of prior year findings and management's recommendations. Then on slide 8 and slide 9, we have a summary of the open prior year recommendations and the status of those recommendations. Under professional standards, the auditor is required to communicate certain matters associated with the execution of the audit to those charged with governance. These items are presented in slides 11, 12, 13, and 14, and fulfill our requirements to communicate these matters to those charged with governance over the financial reporting process. We want to make you aware of some new and proposed accounting standards that will be applicable to the district in the coming fiscal years. Please note that GASB 87, which is a lease standard, is applicable for fiscal year 2022, and the financial reporting model project will likely affect the presentation of the district's budgetary comparison statements and schedules, which are of particular importance on Capitol Hill. Our audit approach and various phases of our audit are disclosed here on this slide. Given the unique circumstances of the fiscal year 2021 audit in a COVID environment, we focus certain audit procedures on those unique risks present in this COVID environment, such as IT risk present due to employees working remotely and in-person work environments, the impact on the district's operations, the unemployment compensation fund, and various new funding on the COVID federal programs. Our fully integrated audit team was made up of a main Aquifer team, a team to specifically test identified information technology risk to the district's Aquifer, and teams auditing various standalone entities, which are just standalone entities. We appreciate the guidance and support provided to the McCollum Jones audit team by the Office of the Inspector General, the Office of the Chief Financial Officer, and all district personnel involved in the fiscal year 2021 audit. This concludes our prepared remarks. We'll be happy to answer any questions you may have about our fiscal year 2021 independent audit of the district. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. CFO Fitzroy Lee.
Yes, Chairman, I'm going to share my slides.
Stop sharing. Okay.
Can you see the slide?
See the cover page.
Okay, let me.
Yes. Looks like you're good to go.
All right. Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson and members of the Committee of the Whole. I am Fitzroy Lee, Acting Chief Financial Officer of the District of Columbia. I appear before you today to report and discuss the fiscal year 2021 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, or Aquifer. With me today is Kimberly Williams, Deputy CFO for the Office of Financial Operations and Systems, as well as other members of the OCFO executive team who will assist in answering questions. I am pleased to report that the district's financial position remains strong. The positive results reflected in the fiscal year 2021 annual financial report could not have occurred without our continued collective financial discipline and sound financial management practices. I would like to recognize the hard work of agency, program, and financial staff who contributed to the successful management and accounting of the district's financial resources during yet another extraordinary year. I would particularly like to recognize the employees of the Office of the Financial Operation and Systems and the Associate Chief Financial Officers and their staff for their outstanding performance during fiscal year 2021. I also want to thank the City Administrator and the Inspector General for working with my office to produce this report. We're very proud that we were able to produce and issue a financial report with no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies at the level of the annual comprehensive financial report for the 7th year in a row. However, we will continue to collaborate with the CA and agency program staff to ensure that management letter findings are effectively remediated. The mayor, district council, agencies, and all segments of this government should be proud of the district's fiscal year 2021 results, the details of which are highlighted in today's presentation. I will now walk you through the presentation, which summarizes some of the key findings of the report. So, as has been discussed or mentioned several times, we have a clean audit opinion, and this is our 25th consecutive year. No material weaknesses or significant deficiencies that rise to the level of the annual financial report, and no yellow book report for the 7th consecutive year. Pension and retiree healthcare trusts remain fully funded with increased net positions. Federally and locally mandated reserves are all full, and the ratings for our GO bonds and our income tax bonds remain strong. So this is the source of the $11 billion in revenue that has been reported in the annual financial report. And as you can see, the income taxes on individual and business constitute the majority of that, followed very closely by the real property tax and then the sales and use tax. And together those constitute about 3/4 of the revenue that funds the government. And this is shows where the monies are spent, where those resources are spent. So as you can see, public education system is the largest single area of spending, followed by human support services, and then public safety and justice. And together those constitute about 60% of the total spending. So I turn now to discuss the revenue performance for fiscal year 2021. As has been mentioned before, revenues exceed what was budgeted by $576 million. And most of that, the majority of that came from income taxes. That's income taxes on businesses and individuals, followed closely by sales taxes. And even though sales taxes are at much less than pre-pandemic level, it has recovered much better than we had forecasted. And so that has contributed to the revision. So let's go back to when we started. So we have 576 million where it exceeds the budget, but let's look how that came about. And I just want to remind everybody here where we started from. The budget was developed in April. The forecast that underlies that budget was developed in April of 2020. And if you recall, we were right there in the depths of the pandemic at the time. So we were coming off a year, fiscal year 2019, where revenue growth was strong. And we emerged, very strong from that year. And the start of fiscal year 2020 was also very strong. But as you know, on March 11th, 2020, there was a public health emergency was declared due to the COVID-19 virus. And immediately, we anticipated that there would be devastating drops in our local revenue, especially from the sales taxes, as commuters stopped coming into the city and economic activity was almost at zero. So at the time, the fourth quarter hotel was 87% below the prior year. Restaurants were operating at 25% of the prior year levels, and there were 43% fewer hospitality jobs than the year before. And the first week that the pandemic hit, the stock market was falling at the time. So the S&P 500 stock price index was down almost 34% at that time. During that time also, one of the things that happened is cash, the municipal bond market and corporate bond market were almost frozen. So cash was a real concern because there was no liquidity. And at that time, the CFO in the CFO organization, we were discussing what to do about cash if property owners couldn't pay their property tax And at the time, sales tax revenue, as I mentioned before, from hospitality sector disappeared. And so this was a really critical time when we know that the economy, because economic activity had stopped, the economy was in the doldrums. At that time, on the budgeting side, it was initially unclear as to what part of the COVID-related charges could be paid for by federal funding. And so that was another concern in terms of our cash. And so it was in this climate that we made that April revenue forecast, where it was very difficult to anticipate when the recovery would happen because the pandemic was ongoing, and the epidemiologists were predicting a flattening of the curve, but nobody knows at what point this would end. And that's the climate in which we made the forecast for the fiscal 2021 budget. Subsequent to making that forecast and the budget, these are some of the things that happened in fiscal year 2021 that really lifted the economy and prevented the economy from going into a tailspin. There was a massive federal relief to individuals and businesses to the tune of $3.2 billion that was injected into the economy in fiscal year 2021. And this excludes the direct federal grants. So these went directly to individuals in the form of unemployment benefits, the child tax credit, and economic impact payments to households. And then to business, there was the Paycheck Protection Program that injected a considerable amount of money in the economy. And so with the injection of enormous amount of stimulus, the economy started to recover, although employment lagged. And as some of the council members have mentioned, employment, especially in the hospitality and leisure sector, is still below what they were prior to the pandemic. But as the recovery continues, what we saw, the stock market soared. There were certain companies that did really, really well, and that was also reflected in corporate profits. And so both stock market gains and corporate profits were up significantly, even though most offices were still operating remotely, and so economic activity was still down in the district itself for most of 2021. As vaccines were deployed and the economy started to come back to life, what we saw was that there was some improvement on the tourism front, but conferences, which is a major source of our sales tax revenue, was still down. There were 2 large conferences in fiscal year 2021 compared to an average of 20 prior to the pandemic. And hotel occupancy, even though it rose to 43% in October 2020, it rose in September 2021 from 23% the year before. It was still well below the 78% occupancy that we usually observe around that time of the year. And then right as we were beginning to recover, there was the emergence of the Delta variant. So this is the context in where we started at a point when we were doing the revenue forecast that was the basis for the budget. We were at almost the lowest point of the economy at that time. And since then, with the help of the federal government, the economy recovered robustly. But we do make quarterly revenue estimates. And so as you can see here, as the economy improves, as measured here by wage growth and the stock market performance, we did revise the estimate to reflect what we were seeing as the economy recovered. And this is why we do quarterly revenue estimate, because we know we're making a budget that's, we start almost 18 months before the end of the fiscal year for which we're making the budget. And the economic circumstances can change, and it did change in this case dramatically. And so we reflected the improving performance in our revenue estimates at the time. So this is where we were on the revenue side. On the spending side, we had 151 million in underspending, and that's about 1.6% of our revised budget. And that's quite in line with the underspending we've seen in previous years, where it's usually between 1% and 2%. So now looking at the overall surplus and the composition of that surplus. So if we measure the budget surplus just by looking at revenue in excess of expenditures, it's about 1.1 billion. But as I mentioned before, as the economy improved, we were increasing the revenue for revenue estimates to reflect the improvement in the economy. And the other part of the surplus that we knew about 387 million of the surplus. And the other part of that was that we also it became more clear to us which part of the local source revenue could be substituted with federal funds as that become available. So we knew this $387 million in surplus in fiscal year 2021, and that was incorporated in a supplemental budget for fiscal year 22. So it has been incorporated into our fiscal year 22 budget and financial plan, leaving about 697 million in surplus. And that surplus constitute additional revenues that came in September and December that was too late to be incorporated in the budget and financial plan. And of course, the underspending, which we knew at the end of the fiscal year. And there were other changes, mostly in the form of revenue, dedicated taxes, transfers from TIF and pilots, and other accounting adjustment to the revenue after our December forecast. So that's the composition of the surplus. So I turn now to where the surplus goes. So the surplus, as you know, I think the chairman mentioned this, that they're already spoken for in terms of we have these funds that we by law required to be funded, whether it's federal law or local law. And as a result of that, the surplus, the fund balance has risen from 339 million from about 3.3 billion in fiscal year 2020 to 3.6 billion in 2021. And this is where the surplus has been, the 3.6 billion has been allocated. So on this side, we can see the federally mandated, the fiscal stabilization and the cash flow reserve, which constitute about 2 months of working capital that's, I will talk about some more, that's available for the normal functioning of our government. And then here we have what's reserved for future budget. And I mentioned the 387 that is already, it's in this pot. What's reserved for debt service and reserved for other purposes, mostly in O-type revenues. And then by law, whatever is left over is split between the pay-go capital, which this year we've injected about 283 million, and an equal amount reserved for housing production and trust fund. So that's where the reserve has been allocated to. These are the different funds that have been allocated to. So one other thing I mentioned is our working capital. And as a result of the surplus, all both emergency and contingency funds, which are federally mandated, are filled, as well as the locally mandated fiscal stabilization and cash flow reserve fund have all been replenished and are full. And I want to say that with those being full, it gives us our 60 days of working capital. And I want to explain a bit about how we use this working capital. So these reserves are, they're not static throughout the fiscal year. Throughout the fiscal year, they're used extensively. And as the chairman remarked, one of the uses is to tide us over the times when the revenue flows. So revenue flows to the district, they come in uneven. Two of the largest, as I pointed out in that pie chart, are income tax and property tax. property tax comes in twice a year, in March and in September. And the income tax has the largest influx during April when the filings are due. In between that time, we still have to make payments. We have to pay the regular bill. And in the past, what we would do is during the time when we don't have these big cash inflow, we would have to go and borrow in order to fund our basic needs that all the things that we have to do in between those influx of revenue. And we funded that through tax revenue anticipation notes, or TRANS. And it's borrowing, which means that we have borrowing costs in terms of debt and in terms of fees. And so by paying those borrowing costs, that would be less money that would go towards other essential services. And then the second part of it is that it's used in terms of when emergencies arise. And I mentioned that during the depths of the pandemic, there was a question about whether we could delay sales tax for businesses that were hurting at the time. And we were able to do that. And we were able to do that because when we did the analysis of our cash flow, we were able to see that we did have the cash because we were coming off 2019, which we had again replenished these funds. But throughout the year, we're using these as emergency arise. We're using them to make sure that we're not living from, what households would say, from paycheck to paycheck. And so it's very important that we maintain these reserves. The other part that the surplus allows, the strong financial position allows us to do is to fully fund our pension and other post-employment benefits. And, the fact that we're fully funded is very unique in the US, because many municipal governments of our size have been unable to fully fund those. And that poses a fiscal cliff as people start to retire. For the district, it's fully funded and it has done very well last year, partly because a stock market, as we mentioned before, has been really growing very strongly. But fully funding those is something that's very unusual. And when I meet with other CFOs, this is something that is the envy of CFOs everywhere. So just to summarize, once again, we receive a clean, unmodified audit opinion, no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. We continue to be affected by COVID-19, and we saw just, over the winter, the surge in because of the Omicron. So we're still being affected, but we have been spared the worst of it because of intervention by the federal government through the CARES, ARPA, and the Federal Reserve action that they took to limit the impact of the liquidity crunch that came during the depth of the pandemic. And then with federally and locally mandated reserves are maintained at the 60 days level. We're fully funding our pension and retiree healthcare. And then we have been able to put $283.2 million in each of the PAYGO Capital and Housing Production Trust Fund. And so with that, I am here to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, Dr. Lee. Questions will come when we complete the testimony. Kevin Donahue.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mendelson, members of the council. I'll have a short presentation, but I will start as my screen is about to be shared. I'm Kevin Donahue, City Administrator for the District of Columbia. I'm joined here with Jenny Reed, Director of the Office of Budget and Performance Management. On behalf of Mayor Muriel Bowser, I am pleased to deliver the executive's testimony on the fiscal year 2021 Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, better known as the Aquifer. But fiscal year 21 continued to be a very challenging year in our city's history. While we made significant progress in combating the effects of COVID-19, our experiences with the Delta and Omicron variants demonstrated how important it is that we remain flexible in responding to fast-changing public health and economic situations on the ground. I am grateful for the work done by our district government employees Every day, thousands of employees are cleaning our streets, providing emergency medical care, putting out fires, supporting students, and delivering critical services to our residents. They deserve our thanks and gratitude on a job well done. Under Mayor Bowser's leadership and the work of the public health and emergency management teams, 92% of our eligible residents are at least partially vaccinated and nearly 70% are fully vaccinated. Although we saw case numbers spike during the most recent surge, cases have plummeted and our hospitalizations remain stable. We are in a very different financial position than we were a year ago when I testified for the fiscal year 2020 Aquifer. But there are several issues on the horizon that pose risk to the district's continued progress. The economic stimulus and infrastructure investments are not something that we will likely see again. The administration is committed to spending those dollars prudently and avoiding creating an unsustainable fiscal cliff. I started working in DC government 20 years ago, and I don't think in our city's modern history we've faced the challenges we have over the past 2 years. And our prudent financial management has allowed us to weather the most recent storm we've experienced. Now I'll begin to jump into the presentation, which is having a hard time being pulled up. Let me give it 1 minute. Mr. Chairman, we're having a hard time pulling up the presentation. What I will do for the sake of time, because I'm sure many of the points that I'll raise will be woven into our questions, is I'll submit the presentation as well as the accompanying notes as part of the formal testimony to the council. And with that, I will thank you for your time. Thank my team who helped prepare the testimony, and we can move on to questions.
So, Mr. City Administrator, you do have this these slides and you're giving up on trying to present them?
I'm looking across at the person who is trying to present them.
I'm checking with my staff. I think we're good on our end.
You are good on your end.
Because I'm willing to give it a minute. I always like slideshows. That's how I got through public schools. I live for the slideshows. What can I say? I was horrible on the geometry homework. Slideshows were great.
We've been unable to share our screen, Mr. Chairman.
It looked like for a moment somebody was coming in to help.
I don't think we're able to overcome the technical challenges, albeit 2 years into our pandemic. So, Mr. Chairman, I think for what I can do is I'll submit the slide deck and the written testimony that accompanies it for the record, and we can go to our rounds of questions.
Then let's proceed with at least one round of questions. I think members should count on one round, which will be 10 minutes, and I will start. I do want to ask this, Mr. Inspector General, the contract, the annual cost for the contract for the audit?
Is this option year was 1.6 million.
Okay. And Mr. Chief Financial Officer, Dr. Lee, the revenue surplus for FY21, which is 576 million, something like that, that does not include revenues from the tax increase voted last year. Is that correct?
The one from last year, no, because that was for future years.
Yeah, so that would show up, but it was not in the FY21.
No.
Let me ask, I'm not sure who I'm going to ask this of, about the retirement board deficiency. Maybe this is to the auditor. Can you explain more what the deficiency is with the, or deficiencies plural with the retirement board? And please be mindful of my time.
Yes, sir. This is a finding that has been around since fiscal year 2019 that relates to accounting procedures and analysis, account reconciliations related to the opening balances. There was also a portion of the finding that related to investment manager fees and ensuring that those fees that were being paid were in accordance with the terms and provisions of the investment manager agreements. And lastly, there was a recommendation around putting in place written policies and procedures manual. Those were the three specific findings.
And this is a significant deficiency for the retirement board's audit?
Yes, that's correct.
And it goes back to 2019. They haven't fixed it. How can we be confident? I don't know if this is for you, maybe it's for the Inspector General, that the retirement board will get this resolved this year.
I'm going to continue to engage DCRB to address the root causes that are outlined in the 2019 findings that have carried forward. Until I have confidence that they've addressed the root causes, we're going to continue to report these findings.
And if they're not resolved, it could affect our audit next year?
That is correct. Well, maybe not next year, maybe the year after that.
And do the significant deficiencies in the retirement board, do they relate at all to the federal subpoenas?
That's something I can't talk about.
Let me ask the auditor regarding the UDC. They don't have a significant deficiency, is that correct? But it's an internal deficiency?
It's considered a control deficiency, which is lesser in significance to a significant deficiency or material weakness.
And could you describe that briefly?
These are findings that came from our IT team, and it was suggested that they develop and implement an incident monitoring policy, and also periodically review the firewall rules that they have. So that's what was related to UDC.
And basically, both of these deal with, they're important because they're if they implement those controls, then they protect themselves from hacking and cyber attacks.
Yes, to the extent that any of us can be protected, yes, sir, it does. It improves their ability to provide protection of their files.
And they were recommendations by they sort of initiated with Octo.
That's correct.
Our
IT team worked with the Octo team.
Let me see. With universal paid leave, I'm not sure I'm going to ask this, of this Chief Financial Officer. So the universal paid leave fund ended 21 with I believe, a $200 million. Are the revenues and expenditures with regard to universal paid now in balance?
So we have more revenues than the expenditure. So there was a surplus that's added to the previous balance.
Now we transferred some surplus, but you're saying even after transferring it, we're seeing that the revenues are still greater than the expenditures.
And I think that's part of the set. So the question, I'm interpreting the question to mean whether for the fiscal year, the revenues exceeded expenditure, which is yes.
No.
And even after the transfer, we do have 100 million more, if that's what you're asking.
What I'm getting at is, are the fund revenues and expenditures now in balance? So for the first year, there weren't expenditures that were basically budgeted, but now that we're getting more experience, are they in balance?
No, the revenue continues to exceed the expenditures.
With regard to events DC, can you confirm, I guess this is to the CFO, that there was no excess cash to transfer at the end of the fiscal year? Have you done that calculation?
I don't believe we have done that calculation. That's something that we do after the annual financial report. So we will do the calculation. But what I can say is that this year, the revenues, as you know, that goes to the convention center comes from hospitality sector, and they were actually much less than anything that we had forecasted. And in fact, I know that they had to use fund balance to manage their budget. So I wouldn't expect that there would be anything to transfer.
Well, I know their net position decreased by 57.2 million or 15%.
Right.
When will you do the
Right.
calculation on the excess cash transfer?
Now that we have all the financial results, we should be able to do it in short order, I'd say in a week or two.
And then you'll send me a letter,
I will send you a letter.
which is the same as sending it to the
detailing
council.
Yes.
The capital asset replacement scheduling system, or CARS, was designed to prioritize our capital needs and determine how much funding is available to address those needs. To what extent has your staff been able to add DC Housing Authority capital assets to CARS?
So we are actually right in the tail end of that process. So we have worked with them over the last couple of years to do the analysis, get all the data. It has all been entered into the CAR system, and we're putting the finishing touches to that analysis. So we should have something to present. You'll be able to see over the next several weeks.
We managed to end fiscal year 21 with full reserves. The quarterly reports indicate that we make extensive use of our reserve funds throughout the fiscal year. Would you advise that we change any of the reserve fund rules to allow more fund balance to be used during a recession?
The answer to that would be no. And in my presentation, I did spend some time outlining the use of that fund balance and how it has helped us, not just in the pandemic, but just in the regular functioning of.
But my question was whether the experience would suggest any changes to the rules, and you're saying no. Mr.
No.
Lucas, are there any additional Aquifer-related deliverables that we should look for over the next few weeks?
No, Chairman, all Aquifer deliverables were delivered on February 1st.
And again, thank you that we got the management letter. That's really very helpful. My last question. McConnell Jones issued 2 recommendations pertaining to district leases that were intended to improve the effectiveness of internal controls over the district's operations and programs. DGS acknowledged the need to improve accounting and financial reporting around leases and indicated that they would work to complete an inventory of tenant balances by the end of January 2022. Was DGS able to complete an inventory of tenant balances? And did this resolve issues identified in the audit? That might be for the city administrator. Did they complete the inventory?
According to DGS, they completed the inventory. There's still work to do on one of the audit recommendations related to coming into compliance with GASP 87. That will require the rest of the fiscal year in collaboration between DGS, my office, and the CFO's office.
So from your perspective, some of the issues are resolved, but there's still some work to do, which will be completed this year.
That's correct.
Thank you. And those were actually all of my questions. Councilmember Nadeau, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. CFO, how much of the FY21 surplus was due to revenues being revised up from the December estimate, and how much was underspending or other sources?
So 576 million was due to revenue, and 151 million was underspending.
Okay. And can you discuss the district's debt restructuring in FY21? Did the district restructure debt to reduce the debt service reserves needed?
Yes, and yes, so that's a very good question, Councilmember. So we did, looking at the IT, the income tax secured bonds, we did restructure the debt, and as a result of that, the requirements in terms of what has to be held by reserve was reduced. And in my presentation, you probably noticed that it was lower than previous year.
And that was because of the restructuring.
Right.
Are there any further plans to restructure? And has this affected our current and future borrowing capacity?
We restructure, as the climate changes. As of now, we don't have any plans to do any more restructuring, but as the environment changes, we will take a look at it.
How has the fiscal and budget position of the district affected our assessment with bond rating agencies? Is there anything you expect to see changing?
No, as I said in my presentation, we have had contact with the ratings agency throughout the year, and the fact that we've been able to manage very well through the recession is a positive. And so far, there's no indication that there will be any changes in our ratings at this time.
Great. Can you discuss in detail how we used the contingency cash fund in FY21? And can you share if any of these uses were new compared to how we used the fund in the past?
So, in over the fiscal year 2021, we used about 550 million in contingency. And as you know, the contingency is reserved, used in terms of emergencies that arise throughout the fiscal year. And as we use them and funds become available, we replenish. So what I would say is that, of course, the pandemic, was a unique challenge. So, as you know, we went through several waves of the virus, and each time there were new requirements. But in terms of how it's used, that's what it's there for, and it has been used in, structurally in a similar manner that we've used it in previous years. So the answer to your question, it's used in accordance with, the way it was designed to be used, just like in previous year. And the only difference was that we were operating in a pandemic emergency.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I see Director Reed may have some more specifics here.
Yeah, Council Member, Director Reed will go into some specifics. What I'll say is the uniqueness from my perspective is that it was used heavily to be able to have the cash available to respond to COVID-19. And about 75% of the cash uses were in fact direct responses. And then Director Reed can highlight some of those prominent ones to give you a sense of that.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, council members. And so thank you for the question. We have really heavily utilized the contingency cash reserve in order to be able to fund our COVID-19 needs. One of the main ways that we get reimbursed through the federal government on our COVID expenses is from the FEMA Public Assistance Program. That program, though, is a reimbursement-based program. So as we have expenses, we submit documentation and forms to FEMA, and then they reimburse us. And to date, we've received about $371 million in reimbursements of about $515 million of costs. In order, though, to provide the needed cash flow, that's how we use the contingency reserve. Otherwise, we would have to make cuts in agencies' budgets in order to sort of front those costs. So a very small portion over the last 2 years has been used for non-COVID needs. And as the city administrator mentioned, about 70 to 80% goes to our COVID costs. And just to give you a sense of how it's going in 22, we've used about 87% of the reserve so far, just responding to COVID-19 needs here in the city.
How many, can you give me a sense of how much of the funding went to human services programs?
Could I follow up with you to get a more specific number? Because the allocations we make, there's probably about 45 different allocations. But yeah,
yeah,
I will do that.
Yeah, great. It'd be helpful to know, given how much that agency was asked to ramp up on COVID response.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So when the district received federal funding in FY21, what was the process by which money ultimately got to each agency budget? Does it first come to a district-wide fund or a DEMPED fund before making its way to the agency budget to be dispersed? How does that work?
So council member, I can jump in, and CFO, please feel free to jump in as well. So the funds, through the main funds through the American Rescue Plan, that flexible funding, that came in through Treasury in one big lump. It was budgeted into agency budgets after you all approved the budget. Agencies do have to go through a clearance process, however, with us to make sure that once those programs are fine-tuned, they are still eligible uses of the fund. So we go through a process where we review all of their proposed spending in detail and then make sure it's going to meet the requirements. If a funding comes in, let's say through like the Child Care Development Block Grant, which is a specific agency grant, that would go directly to an agency's budget that it was designated for. And then we do hold some COVID funding back in non-departmental account that we use for our immediate COVID-19 response.
Thank you. Can you, this is probably also for you, Director, can you outline all of the federal assistance that was initiated as a result of or during the pandemic that the district is expected to receive in the current fiscal year? An example would be like the second round of federal emergency rental assistance funds.
Great question. So the district will benefit from having a significant amount of federal resources to deploy to assist in equitable recovery. What I would say is there's about $1 billion budgeted in our flexible ARPA funding that will be deployed for a variety of purposes. So it could be for business assistance, it could be for the new career map program that we're launching to help families gain economic security. It could be for the safe passage work that we've launched across the city in Ward 7 and 8. So there's a lot of funding out there. If folks are interested in seeing exactly how it's going to be used, I encourage you to visit the Office of the City Administrator website, where we have an annual report that we submitted to the U.S. Treasury Department, where we outline in narrative form and provide a lot of details on all of the funding, including a program appendix where you can see every single allocation we will make. For the emergency rental assistance funding, I would just say that has been fully deployed. So we have used and spent all $352 million.
What about the 17 million?
We have not got the 17 million yet into our coffers. And CFO can correct me if I think as of yesterday we hadn't had it, so I don't think we still do.
Thank you. What challenges did we see in FY21 relating to the federal government's reimbursement process? And do we still have those challenges?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think as a jurisdiction, the teams performed very well in getting reimbursements for the requests we had. There's a thorough and comprehensive process the federal government puts into place, and HCMA is point on that. So the federal government provides the funding. We always wish the reimbursements were faster, but we've done quite well in trying to get reimbursement for the things that are eligible. And there's a pretty significant interagency committee that does reviews of eligibility and a process we go through to make sure we have the documentation needed to be able to submit for reimbursement.
And if I
Thank
could
you.
just add, I'll just add, we don't yet see an end to the PA reimbursement. So we expect that to continue for some time. So in particular, I'm sure, as you know, that supports our ISAC and PEP-V services for our unhoused residents. And we will continue to rely on those resources to provide those services.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau. Councilmember Pinto, who will be followed by Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. I want to start with Dr. Lee about the reserves fund. So in the letter from you and the mayor, there's a referral to the district reserves equaling 60 days or about 2 months of operating cash. That comes out to 16.67% of the total general fund operating expenses. But in your presentation, that 16.7% is the total amount, totaling all 4 of the contingency cash reserves funds. So can you walk me through how determinations are made as to which of the 4 funds are utilized or can be spent down to maintain that total as the 60-day threshold?
So each of those funds have very specific requirements that are delineated in law. So for the emergency and contingency, the federal funds, that's 6% of the general, the expenditure budget. And for the fiscal stabilization, I think it's 8.3%, and I want to say 16% for the cash flow reserve. 2.34% for the fiscal stabilization, and 8.3 and 8.8% for the cash flow reserve. So, each year we have to look at what the expenditure is and we make those allocations according to those ratios.
But are those percentages the numbers that happen to be true this year to lead us to our total of 16.67%, or are those thresholds that are predetermined at the start of the year that we will not let ourselves go below? Because what I'm trying to understand is I thought the 60-day threshold was for each of the 4 reserves funds, but it looks like now it's just the total, and some are much less than
the 60 days is in respect of the total, and the cash flow reserve and the fiscal stabilization was designed. So the federal funds are set to 6%, the contingency, and the other 2 were designed to get the total to 60 days of operating cash.
Okay, but the metrics that go into that total, or maybe better said, do you all have discretion, utilize discretion every year as to which of those funds you're pulling from, with the still overall goal of maintaining the total of 60-day reserve balance?
Councilmember, I'm just trying to understand. You said which one we're pulling from. So we pull from them throughout the year. At the end of the year, there's a surplus and what we call the water flow model, where we have to fill up certain funds first. And the ones I just described are done in accordance with the size of the budget. So when they're all full, what we will have is 60 days of cash. How we use them throughout the year is also described in law. So, for example, a cash flow reserve is the one we use extensively, just to when we're, the CFO uses that whenever we're in between big infusions of our revenue. And, Director Reed has already described how we've used the contingency fund. The one fund we, as very strict requirement is the the federal emergency fund that has very strict provisions that depends on what's going on in the economy at the time. But each of the uses of these are all describe, how we use them throughout the year is also prescribed in law.
And Councilmember, if I could just jump in to highlight 2 quick points. One is that federal and local law do govern both the levels of the reserves and the way in which funds are distributed. So adjustments have a statutory basis. And the second, and the CFO touched on this, is that in FY21, we did use the entirety of our fiscal stabilization reserve to be able to avoid painful custody programs. So, it may not be a reserve that in a typical year gets utilized, but certainly during the pandemic, it was vital to us.
Okay, so when there are discussions around, go ahead, Director Reed. Director Reed, were you trying to add something?
No, she's having some technical difficulties. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So when there are discussions around the surplus and how we can utilize that surplus, how does that relate to what has already been attributable to each reserve fund?
So, as what I outlined in my presentation, is the use of those 60 days of cash. And for us, it's prudent to maintain that for the normal operation, just good financial practice. And, but it's not just good financial practice. It has very practical implications as the CA and Director Reed has indicated. It really helped us to get through the pandemic in terms of making payments and then waiting for reimbursement from the federal government. And at a CFO level, it prevents us from having to go and borrow to pay the cash. So those are very vital. But in addition to that, in terms of the surplus, the mayor and the council has decided that whatever is left over after we have allocated to all those other funds, half of it will go to Housing Production Trust Fund and the other half goes to PAYGO capital. So those have all been set out in law, and we have allocated the funds as I have described according to the law. In terms of we don't have any discretion as the CFO to make any changes to those allocations. We just follow what is prescribed in the law.
Okay, and those are the $283.2 million amounts that have each been sent to the Housing Production Trust Fund and the PAYGO Capital Fund, respectively?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So one of the things that we've talked about in the last couple of years are continuing increasing surpluses. You started to speak about this a little bit in your presentation, Dr. Lee, but do you think that there would be any other methodology that may lead to a more accurate estimate of where we're going to be each year?
So, thank you for that question, Councilmember. So let me speak to it. For many years, I was the one who did the forecasting, so I understand this process very well. And what I would say to you, I did point out that we start the budget process, the February estimate, which we will release at the end of this month, is the basis for the mayor's budget. And we start a process 18 months before the end of the fiscal year to which that budget will apply. In between that, there are always changes in the economic environment. To explain what happens in terms of, many council members have pointed out surplus year after year. And the reason that happens is because one of our overriding concern is that we make realistic estimates that does not, build in boom from volatile revenue sources. And if, I have done this analysis many years on in terms of what generates the surplus. And it's usually surplus that's coming from stock market performance that feeds into the capital gains and also company profits. If you look at most of the last two revenue forecasts, the bulk of the excess revenue did come from corporate profits or capital gain. And then the other part of it is D taxes. These are taxes that we get from the sale of buildings. And one building can generate tens of millions of revenue. It is really difficult to anticipate. And seeing those surpluses in 1 year does not mean that they're going to be repeated in the subsequent years. So when we make our forecast, we don't plan that these booms that have occurred in the previous year are going to occur. And so when they do happen year after year, it does result in surplus. But it would be very difficult for me. I mean, we see what's happening in the stock market just today, that just as much as you get these revenue, they can disappear in the blink. And it has happened as in my time here in 2001 with the dot-com bubble burst in, and again with the financial market crash in 2008, where these revenues disappeared very quickly. And we want to be able that when it happens, we have the deficit is manageable and we can get through we can have fixed to the budget, and that's the source, why we continue to have surpluses.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. That's very helpful context. I'm out of time. I'll see y'all next round to talk about hospitality. Thanks, Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Henderson, who will be followed by Councilmember Silverman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. The fun thing about going after several colleagues is that they've taken a lot of your questions. So I'm just going to go on and jump right onto some other things. I'd actually like to go back to talking about capital assets and long-term debt. Dr. Lee, that Aquifer mentions that the current CIP funds $9 billion in capital needs through 2027. However, the CFO's capital asset replacement scheduling system, so CARS, has identified another $4.5 billion of unmet need during the CIP. Could you summarize as best you can what that $4.5 billion of unmet need looks like?
So, as you know, from the CAR system, it prioritizes, and there's considerable input from the mayor and the council as to what the priorities. And what's left is, so, and as you know, we also have a debt cap. So in any given year, we can fund only so much capital spending before we bump up on the debt cap. And so what's left are the ones that, in the priority list that cannot be funded now. But part of the reason the mayor and the council decided on allocating half of surplus to pay-go capital is that would help to fund some of those needs. But the unmet needs that we talk about, and I'm happy to have my staff give you the details of what those items are.
Yeah, that would be great.
I don't have them off the.
Do you happen to know what sector? Are we talking about education? Are we talking about public safety? Who has the most?
There's a list, and I'll get. My staff can. So we can get you the list.
Director Reed, were you trying to jump in there?
Councilmember, if I could just jump in here and just add a couple things. So I think that, of course, as the CFO mentioned, there is a debt cap that we have to be funded under. There are needs across the city, right? We know that not all of our facilities are up to full good state of repair. We've been making heavy investments, for example, in our school's HVAC system to try to get improvements in that area. We know that there are more schools on the PACE list that we need to fund, and Mayor Bowser continues to add those schools every single year, right? We know there are roads, bridges, other things that need to be brought up to a state of good repair. That's why we're really excited about the infrastructure bill. The infrastructure bill is going to bring in about $3 billion to the district over the next 5 years, and it's really going to help us chip away at that unmet need. But what I would also say too is that while there are unmet needs, we've been making a really strong push to make investments in our core infrastructure, including like roads, sidewalks, alleys, bridges, schools, and other facilities. So we look forward to having that further discussion with you.
Great. And I hope you didn't take that as a critique. It was honestly just to sort of, I think we should have this discussion when we're sort of talking about budgetary priorities and needs and things like that. In terms of long-term liabilities, I noticed that we saw a decrease due to the fact that we did not issue any GEO bonds or income tax secure revenue bonds in FY21. Could you talk about why we didn't do either one of those? Was that just a circumstantial?
Right. So the previous year, we had done a certain level of refunding. And part of the decrease, as we mentioned before, was that we restructured the income tax secured bonds. And in that restructuring, given our strong financial position, we were able to restructure it to a point where we didn't need as much reserve. But part of why we weren't issuing any new bonds is that we had, during that restructuring, we had done the refunding that was able to fund our capital needs over the span of 2 years. And as I said, we look at the economic environment each time and we decide whether it makes sense to do something like a refunding. But we didn't issue it because we had no need after the restructuring of the previous year.
Okay, I'd like to check in on some real estate issues. Obviously, if you look at the Aquifer numbers, one of the big things that stands out is the fact that deed tax revenues were higher in FY21 as compared to FY22, meaning our real estate market in particular for, residential homes and things like that, did pretty well. I recall that in last year's Aqua, there was a discussion about the increase of sales prices and the number of transactions. What do you think continues to drive this growth in the district? And should we be concerned about a bubble that is coming?
Right. So, thank you, Councilmember. That's a really good question. But the district in several years has always been, so a lot of our deed taxes, the bulk of it does come from commercial real estate transactions. And it comes from those transactions because as the district has made strides in being a place where people want to live, do business, and work. It has been seen as one of the safe places to invest money. So the buying and the selling of commercial real estate is really an indication that people believe that the district has a strong future. And what I would say in terms of whether or not it's a bubble, the nature of bubbles is that it's always difficult to know you're in a bubble and it's only after it pops. But the district is doing well, just like many other cities. And what the surprising thing about the last year's deed tax is that we were in the middle of a pandemic and people didn't know what was going to happen to remote work. And there's still a lot of uncertainty, but people do still see the district as a safe place to, invest in terms of the assets there. So that's good. And we hope that continues as we go forward.
Okay. Something else that caught my eye was an $18.5 million decrease in total assets for the not-for-profit hospital corporation as a result of return of unused COVID-19 stimulus-related money to the general fund, and also the decrease in net patient receivables. I understand the the decrease in patient pieces. I've had that conversation with Ms. Jacobs, but could you further discuss, or I don't know if you can, or maybe Director Reed, the return of the stimulus related money and why it went unused, and if it went back to the general fund, what was it subsequently used for?
I'm happy to answer that question, Council Member. So early on in the pandemic, we provided some funding to hospitals in order to make sure that they could buy the necessary supplies and staff that they needed as we were seeing surges in Omicron. At the same time, there was federal money flowing to hospitals, but they it wasn't happening fast enough. So we used contingency cash and we allocated funding to several hospitals across the city. Not UMC, because it then started receiving some of the federal money, couldn't use the contingency cash because they were using the federal money instead, right?
Okay.
And you had to use the federal money first. So that it just repaid the contingency cash at the end of the fiscal year.
Okay. Okay. And just a random question in terms of the conversation that you were having earlier, I think with Councilmember Nadeau, or maybe it was Councilmember Pinto. How long do we think the FEMA reimbursement, I'm not going to call it scheme, setup is going to continue?
We know it's been extended beyond its the expiration date it had later this spring. We don't know how long it will continue for, but we know we can continue using it beyond what we were expecting to.
Okay. One last question for me. I wanted to discuss some of the spending shifts in the education sector. In particular, it mentions some higher costs were absorbed due to a reduction in expenditures in E-rate and food services programs within DCPS. Now, I imagine that the food service reduction is related to kids weren't in person, but I just wanted to ask for clarification on the E-rate and the food service reduction there.
Yeah, council members. So there was, because of the virtual learning posture and the uncertainty when we were planning the budget for schools early on, how much of that food and security contract would be used. We did see underspending, a significant amount of underspending in those contracts for fiscal year 21, but it was just because the services were not needed at the same level.
All right, I'm over my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Henderson. Councilmember Silverman, to be followed by Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to everyone. And my first question is directly to CFO Lee. Mr. CFO, almost every one of my colleagues has expressed frustration with what has been termed as overly conservative revenue forecasts. And I certainly understand and appreciate your fiscal prudence and strong defense against fiscal deficiency. But again, as I mentioned in your confirmation hearing, I present a solution. Let's establish a fiscal stabilization reserve, say of 200 million set aside that we can access if revenues do fall short of expectations. And the advantage of this, of course, is that, as many members have said, we can then deploy our tax dollars more, I'd say, responsibly and urgently toward our significant needs. So you said you would consider this approach. How can we move forward on something like this?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember Silverman. So one thing I guess I should mention is that we do have, that was created by the council, we do have a fiscal stabilization fund, and one of our reserve is a fiscal stabilization fund, and it was created for that purpose. And it was one of the reasons we were able to get through the pandemic. We did use the fiscal stabilization fund extensively during the depths of the pandemic, and we have used it in 2021. So I am not sure how your proposal differs from the current fiscal stabilization fund.
So why don't we just do, I actually have more questions. So my question would be, well, we created a fund I keep hearing an answer from you of, well, things are volatile, we're not sure, we need to stabilize. So we have this fund, let's use it. And my understanding is that from you now is that fund allows us to deploy our resources a little bit more generously with confidence in your fiscal, that we don't have to be so conservative. But I think this might be a better conversation to have off the dais. But I think we should use that fund, as apparently you're saying it was intended to allow us to more accurately deploy our resources. Okay, let me move to our shared priorities. And I think certainly affordable housing is one of those priorities. Let me say, I think Mayor Bowser deserves a lot of credit for invigorating the Housing Production Trust Fund. But Dr. Lee, I want to ask you a few things about whether we're putting too much money into the fund at this point. So if I'm looking correctly at the trust fund financials, and just for those who want to follow along, I'm on page 51, Exhibit 2B. So the trust fund started the year with a balance of $116 million. We added 86 million from the dedicated tax. And then on top of that, we added 174 million from the fiscal year 20 surplus, because I think, as has been mentioned here, the surplus goes to two places, the trust fund and PAYGO. Now, again, to the administration's credit, we spent $110 million from the trust fund last year. So the fund ended the year with a balance of $266 million that was not committed to producing housing, to projects. So even as we speak, still more money is now flowing into the trust fund through our dedicated tax that we created. So here's my point. Under existing law, the trust fund would now receive an additional $283 million from the fiscal year 21 surplus, so half of the surplus. Now, so first of all, Dr. Lee, is that an accurate assessment of the finances of the trust fund?
I believe so. The starting and ending balance, I am not sure, and my staff is confirming that, but okay. 283 million for sure will be added to the
okay
balance.
Very, right. So like the main point for those who like me don't follow numbers very well is there's a lot of money in there and we're putting a lot more in there. And so here's how I look at this. So right now the trust fund has so much money that we haven't begun to even touch the 174 million in surplus funds from 2 fiscal years ago. So, and as I said, this is not in any way meant to be a criticism of the trust fund. I mean, I think it is a great tool. And the Bowser administration should be commended for using that tool and deploying these funds. But what we have to do is, I think, question whether at this time we should be putting another 283 million into a fund that already has more resources that it can use. So,
could you mind if I jump
Mr.
in?
City Administrator, I guess my question is to you is, I know the administration is trying to put as many dollars to use, but these are way more dollars than we can get out the door. So at what point does it make sense to perhaps think of optimizing these dollars in another housing program?
We will absolutely get the money out the door. Let me provide just some additional information to help provide some data behind that statement. So through the end of December, $106 million is obligated, including approximately 90 million of the prior year loan carryover obligations. GHCD has identified $228 million of projects in the pipeline and another $136 million of new projects from the last RFP. If all those projects went to closing in FY22, which they will, it will leave approximately 4 million uncommitted. So we certainly recognize the need and importance of moving money, and we would
Mr. City Administrator,
fund it at a level that we can move.
Does that include the 283 million that we're now going to put into the fund? That's my point. I'm not.
Yes.
I guess I'm not doubting that you are trying to commit as many dollars as possible. I'm just saying we keep putting more and more in, and that can't be spent in that year.
It does, council member. And one thing I just want to add too is that The trust fund does tend to carry balances year over year because of the time of the closing of the loans. So even though the funds are actually awarded, sometimes it can take a year and a half, up to 2 years for projects to fully close and the loans to be dispersed. We certainly saw challenges during the pandemic where projects, were temporarily slowed and then had to restart again. So it does appear on paper like the trust fund is carrying a big balance, but as the city administrator just mentioned, the demand for the trust fund has not stopped. We have a pipeline that will completely exhaust all of the new resources and be ready for even more.
So I want to get us out, and this is a frustration of mine in general, in a dichotomy of like it's either good or bad. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't put dollars into the trust fund and that there's a great need for it. What I'm saying is the pivoting, is the calibrating, is the resiliency. We know right now that there's a tremendous need for emergency rental assistance. Because this isn't an either or. I'm frustrated by that kind of thinking. I have to be honest, is that we need to keep people in their homes, in their rental homes, and then we need to build homes for others or to purchase. And so we need to do both. And my point is that, are we oversaturating one approach and underfunding another? And maybe we should just get to a little bit more of an equilibrium here. Do you disagree with that, Director Reed?
Let me,
But maybe we just need to calibrate a little bit differently. Mr. Chairman, I still have a few seconds.
I fundamentally agree that it's not either or. I think on the trust fund, we have to show that we can move the money. I think on the immediate need for preventing evictions and rental assistance, that's something that I don't think needs to be seen through the prism of the trust fund, which really will have a pipeline to be able to spend that money. And it's something that we're looking closely at as we develop the FY22 supplemental.
Very good. Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thank you, Councilmember Silverman. Councilmember McDuffie, who will be followed by Councilmember Che. There's a question whether Councilmember McDuffie is here at the moment. Not seeing him. Is Councilmember Che here? Not seeing her. I'll come back to you if you show up. Councilmember Allen, who would be followed by Councilmember Robert White. Councilmember Allen? I think our questions from the other council members took all the questions out of the room. Councilmember Robert White, are you here? Councilmember Bonds, followed by Councilmember Louis George.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman. And I guess given my colleagues' questions about the Housing Production Trust Fund, it's a great opportunity for me to follow so we can continue this dialogue. Thank you again to our witnesses. We really appreciate this opportunity. So I think if I can just start by following along with what Councilmember Silverman's, presentation was about. If we look at the 549 million that is or has accrued and will accrue in the trust fund, can you please, Mr. Donahue, give us a breakdown of how that money is planned to be spent by way of the obligations that have been made?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Councilmember Bonds. And
okay, thank you.
So as the city administrator mentioned, there's about $228 million of projects in the pipeline and another $136 million of new projects that were unable to be funded in our last RFP. So combining those together, plus an additional solicitation that will happen later this year, we're ready to put out another RFP. We will get through all of the funds. There might be maybe 4 million uncommitted, but I doubt that that funding will stay just given the tremendous interest. And of course, you know, a portion of the trust fund is also used for administrative purposes to be able to make sure that we can make all of those loans in a given year.
Yeah, the 15% administrative fee, how is that accounted? Is that accounted on a annual basis, which is what the law says, or is it somehow with the cumulative as we look at this 549 million? Can't hear you.
Sorry, council member. It is on an annual basis as required by law. That would be quite a hefty admin fee if we did it on the fund balance.
Well, you know, the issue that my colleague was raising is very appropriate, and we struggle with this as we try to think about how much money the mayor actually puts in the trust fund on an annual basis, given the sources. And so it's very hard to for the public to understand when we say we have 400 million, we have 100 million, and the anticipation is that that money will be depreciated in that FY year, but that's not really how this fund is operated. Also, with the trust fund, it makes it clear that there's 50%, most recently, I did the law, changed the law in FY19, that 50% of the funds would be devoted to projects for under 30% AMI. All right, if we look at that, a great portion of the housing that we're attempting to renovate in public housing falls in that category. And it seems to me that when we talk about these funds and we talk about the statutory requirement of any additional surplus or 50% going to the trust fund, maybe we ought to think about how the housing authority can use some of those funds on a regular basis so that we can get some of those projects moving faster. As you well know, we haven't heard yet, and I heard the CFO indicate, Dr. Lee indicate that the CARS system will be up soon. We knew it would take close to 18 months once we had everything loaded. So my question is, are we able to somehow take a look at what is in the CAR system, pull some projects out, and then fund them through the trust fund? Would that be a recommendation, Mr. City Administrator?
I would not, like the discussion I think I had with Councilmember Silverman, I would not view it as an either or. There is a demand and need for the production of additional affordable housing. I think as a city, we can do that, and we can show that we can create that inventory without having to divert that money into to be able to rehabilitate or renovate DCHA properties. We were able to make significant investments in both, and both will be priorities as we develop the FY23 budget.
Well, you know, Mr. City Administrator, I'm afraid we're going to reach a point in our community where we will come up with a similar fund of local dollars that will take care of the needs in public housing. Statutorily, the trust fund does not indicate that monies cannot go towards projects at the housing authority. So I'll just leave that alone, but it's food for thought, and would love to have a chance to talk to you more about that. And with you, Ms. Reed, I think it's something that, you know, this is the new normal. Things have changed. And it just seems to me one of our responsibilities as a government is to take care of the people who are here. We're always thinking about how we can grow. And this is what the public is saying. You know, the emphasis is on grow, and grow means new people and not so much putting emphasis on the people who are already here. And so I really want us to break it down to the very smallest unit, which is the people, the ordinary people. Some may be watching. They all know about our budget, and they know that, you know, we increase our budget almost $1 billion annually. Okay, the income. And so how are we spending it? And to even suggest that we would not want to spend it on the people who are here, and we are going to, not that you said that, Mr. City Administrator, you didn't say that, but my question is, how do we get to a process where we focus on taking care of replenishing, refurbishing what we have, because we know that our housing stock is aging? And how do we take care of some of these needs up front before we launch off into the future and what we can grow? So that's one big concern that I have. Also, you mentioned in the Dr. Lee, you mentioned you would provide a list of the unmet needs to Councilmember Henderson. I too would like to see that, and I'd like to see it broken down by department, so we have a real clear understanding of what the unmet needs. Most of them will probably be the large infrastructure projects that Ms. Reed mentioned, but there are some other kinds of unmet needs. I certainly would like to have access to that. And then there were a couple of questions that I hope I still have a moment that I had. With the agencies that are underspending, can you please, do you have before you now that you can share whether or not these are agencies that year after year tend to have underspending, or does each year generate a new list of agencies that underspend?
We can certainly provide a list of the agencies and their amount of underspending, as well as the reasons for them. We had relatively, by my estimation, little underspending this year compared to the budget. And as you'll see when you read through the list we send you, a lot of it does connect back to the fact we were in a pandemic, and it really radically changed the level and type of need and demand that agencies have. So agencies, some had to expend far more resources. In other parts of that same agency, they might have had a real drop off of demand for services, but we can provide that detail.
All right, okay. Mr. Chairman, I think that, and if I could also hear from Dr. Lee, if I could get a briefing on where we are with the CAR system, that's one of my concerns. Want to make sure that it meshes with what is the ongoing work at that agency.
Certainly, Councilmember Bonds, and as I mentioned before, we're at the tail end of the process, and as soon as we gotten all the analysis completed, we'll be more than happy to brief you.
Okay, could I have a status briefing before you complete it in the next, let's say, 3
Yes,
weeks?
we can certainly tell you where we are in the process. Yes.
All right, thank you. And Chairman, am I out of time? Because I wanted to ask about the pension funding.
Yes, you have the same clock that the rest of us have.
Oh, I don't see it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all so much. And thank you for an excellent job.
Thank you, Councilmember. Yes, if one's in gallery view, the clock should be in the top row. Councilmember Janice Lewis George, followed by Councilmember Trayon White.
Thank you, Chairman. And I apologize for joining late today. I was in another session with parents. So before I dig into questions, I do want to extend my thanks and congratulations to the team at OCFO and in the city administrator's office for the hard work that went into this report. And congrats to our interim CFO, Dr. Lee, on his Aquifer in this role. Our city is truly fortunate to be in such a solid financial shape despite widespread pandemic challenges. However, I know it's already been said here numerous times today, but I need to reiterate that while the balance sheets we're discussing are strong and the conversations I'm having with my constituents paint a very different picture. And a predictable picture given the vast inequalities we knew would play out in this pandemic from day one. No one wants to be here discussing why we have a $586 million in surplus revenue when we only budgeted $14 million for ERAP in fiscal year 21. I think, the eviction crisis was real then, and it's still real today. And I think as city leaders in every level of service, I think we're choosing to tell constituents that we can't help keep them housed when we allow hundreds of millions in surplus revenue to be directed to reserves or to programs like the Housing Production Trust Fund that, yes, are necessary, but in this moment will not prevent someone from being forced out of the city. So I need to understand, in closing out this round of questions, how we can make different choices with our dollars going forward to one, better budget at the scale of our city's need. And I think two, respond in real time with actions that match the urgency of need in our constituents' lives. Because at the end of the day, all of this leads back to how this shows up in people's lives and for people in very real time. And I think sort of that was that balance that Councilmember Silverman was getting to in her questions regarding the Housing Production Trust Fund. I want to start with sort of some questions regarding what forecasting changes have been made from last year to get to last year to this to get a more accurate picture of our revenues, so we are not leaving money on the table when our needs remain great. And I guess related, what changes or updates have been made in real time accounting of spending, and how can the council have a better handle on this real time spending throughout the year?
Thank you, Council Member, and thank you for the question. So in terms of the revenue forecast, in my presentation, I did outline, the economic conditions that were prevailing when we made that estimate for the budget, because the fiscal year 2021 budget was made at the depths of the pandemic crisis, and it was hard to imagine where we are now in terms of the recovery, because I can tell you, there were really dire predictions about what would happen to the economy. Of course, one of the things that changed the equation was the massive amount of federal stimulus that was injected into the economy. And, frankly, we're on the edge of inflation now because, it's just been such a massive stimulus to the economy. So that is one thing that has changed. But I would also like to point out that we do quarterly revenue forecasts. And each quarter, as the economy has improved, we do reflect the changes and the improvement in that forecast. And in fact, some of the improved revenue were incorporated into the fiscal year 2022 budget and financial plan. And the forecast, the $576 million that surplus, mainly came from forecasts that were made in September and December, which would have been too late for the 2022 budget and financial plan.
Right.
But my point is we do inform you when we know that the revenue improvements on a quarterly basis, and what you do with those revenues as they become available, I think, is what you would like you're discussing now.
Right. So I guess I was trying to get a sense of what forecasting changes have been made. Like, I get what's happened in the past. I'm just trying to get a sense of what type of forecasting are we doing differently now as a result of what happened before.
So, we continuously, I'll tell you, we continuously update our models, as the economic conditions have changed. But the things that are changing, that are driving the surpluses are not things that models can change. I mentioned before in the answer to a previous question that we do have these volatile revenue sources, capital gains, deed taxes, corporate profits, that drive a lot of the surplus. And it is very difficult for any forecasters to predict, for example, what's going to happen to the stock market or corporate profits. So corporate profits, at least at a local level, is very, very difficult to predict, because what you get in profits is the result of what corporate tax planning, and the tax planning may enable you to see considerable profits one year, and then they will tax plan, and then the state or local government won't see that profit in the following year. So it's very, very difficult to predict.
So I guess what I'm trying to get to, so I think it was pretty clear in maybe mid-September before the fiscal year closed, that state DC was going to be depleted before the end of the calendar year. And it was also clear we were running significant, I guess, revenue surpluses. And so I guess what could have been done in September to use reserves to bolster state DC and keep access to rental aid available while not risking inability to replenish reserves. Same for the need for more testing in school, which we were told was unaffordable. What our options are available to us as a council and to the mayor to put money to immediate use in emergencies like these?
I will jump in. It's a very good question because our needs do shift throughout the year. We certainly use contingency cash and the importance of having enough available to be able to respond to unexpected events. You mentioned two specific examples. Certainly, our response in schools, we're able to use both contingency cash, but also federal aid that's available for that purpose. With regards to emergency rental assistance, we certainly did know we were going to deplete the federal funding we had. We did not know at the time, keep in mind, even the scale or scope of what the federal government would give in a reallocation. The response that we have, and this will go back to contingency cash, is we do utilize the ERAP program, and we have been using contingency cash to be able to increase the funding available in that program to be able to meet demand coming into it, as well as other management interventions to be able to avoid eviction. So that's the main tool that we use, and it's been a very vital one over the course of the pandemic.
Okay, I appreciate that. For financial reporting going forward, can the OCFO and Budget Office, provide notice and details to the council when substantial reserves are expended from local reserves and federal contingency account? The quarterly reports are helpful, but don't always, tell us what's happening in real time. Is that possible?
So yeah, that's something we would have to explore, but part of it is, the information. And as you said, things are happening in real time, but that's something that we could look into. And as you mentioned, we do provide you with quarterly reports when they're used, but whether or not we have the resources to provide it much more frequently is something that I would have to explore with my team.
Okay.
I would also add, council member, that you all do get notified every time the mayor utilizes the contingency cash reserve. A letter is sent, I know, to the council budget office. I'm not sure who else on the council gets it, but every time we make an allocation, a copy of that letter that we request to the CFO is also shared with the council.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I was wondering, can you all speak to the city's growth rate and out migration broken out by income level and race? What trends were happening in fiscal year 21, and what trends are you predicting going forward? Can you speak to that?
So in terms of the trends, as you know, the census did report that there was a 20,000 loss of residents, which we don't necessarily agree with, because we have other data that showed that, it might have, their data might be incomplete as to what's happening. but the data that we have don't break it down by income level. What we're planning to do is, we can do that when we receive our tax data. And one of the analysis we're looking forward to is looking at what are we seeing in our detailed individual income tax data about what the migration patterns were, but we don't have it from the aggregate information that the census provides.
All right, if we could do
Thank
income
you.
level and I think race, it would be
Thank you,
important to
Councilmember.
see, to provide services. Thank you, Chairman.
Councilmember Trahan White.
Thank you. I want to thank you guys for joining us today as we try to get a hold during this budget season about the direction of the city. And I'm excited that we have these surpluses, but I'm also concerned that they're not felt throughout the city year after year. Even during a pandemic, we still have extra money left over. I heard Councilmember Anita Barnes try to ask this. I wrote a bill addressing the Housing Production Trust Fund money, in which 50% have to go to low income housing. We saw in the past where the audit indicated that was not the case when it was 40. And then, I talked to the former city administrator. He said that that was not the case, and the numbers wasn't off. And I think I spoke to you, City Administrator Donahue, and you echoed the same thing. So I'm not sure who's telling the truth here. But my question is, for the money that's in the pipeline now, right? It's almost, as you said, it's not, the picture doesn't paint what it really is, as far as the excess of $200+ million is sitting there that's already in the pipeline. How are we reaching those goals now with the money going out to meet the new Housing Production Trust Fund requirements? Where are we with that?
Yeah, great question, Council Member. And I want to make sure we give you the most up-to-date, accurate percentage based on some of the awards that were just announced earlier this week. We are getting closer to that 50% target set by Council Member Barnes and the rest of the council. One of the ways that we've been able to do that is by putting more project and sponsor-based local rent supplement program in the budget. And so, as you know, that funding provides the needed operating subsidy to get to that very low income housing. And what we have been working with DHCD on is to kind of push, as they push, applicants to come in to be able to say, look, we want you to do more 30%. And if we have to add more project-based LRSP during the middle of the fiscal year, or if we have to add more in the out years when we submit the budget, we'll do that to make sure that we can meet that target. But I will get back to you with where we are today based on that pipeline.
Thank you, please. And I just left 800 Southern Avenue. We have a Zoom there tonight, and we are seeing money we put into this building, but it's not turning over to become livable. And there are so many projects I visit along with the DC Office of the Attorney General, DCRA, the Office of Tenant Advocate, about these buildings that are just frankly too old to be livable. And the owners are saying we don't have the money. And they're saying they are applying for Housing Production Trust Fund money over and over again, but not getting it. How are we as a government giving weight to these projects that are in dire need across the city that need immediate funds to even be livable for residents that are currently living there?
Yeah, Council Member, I want to make sure that we provide you with the accurate scoring in the trust fund. But what I would say is that for some of these existing buildings, they may also be great candidates for our Housing Preservation Fund, which really works to make sure we can stabilize affordable buildings and maintain those, right? So we're not just building new, we're keeping what's already affordable, but to your point, the living conditions are brought up. And so why don't we'll follow up with you and your team with DHCD with the specific requirements and weights for both of those funds, so that when you're talking to folks in the community who may want to know how they can apply, we can do that. And I'm sure DHCD too would be willing to host some roundtables to help interested persons learn how to best maximize their chances for success.
Thank you. Could you help me with explaining how do we, what are the barriers to spending the full balance of any given program? If we have excesses excess money is it understaffing? Is it an issue with program management? I'm not sure where we are as far as the spending of the money. And one of the reasons I asked, because I go to the schools, and I was talking to a teacher, I guess 2 Fridays ago at Anacostia, and she was crying in that auditorium, and she was explaining that it's January and she still don't have the stuff she need to teach the kids the curriculum. And it may not be a budget issue per se, but it's something going on that's not allowing teachers to get what they need. And I know, and I don't want to drill down to the DCPS and all that, but I'm concerned that we have this excess money, but yet our schools are under resourced, and still there's a large achievement gap when we should be doing more with this additional funds in the budget.
Let me sort of address that in 2 ways, and thank you for bringing up that example. So some of the larger funds that we have in the budget require us to open the budget up again. So we would submit a supplemental budget, which we're going to do for this fiscal year. When we submit our budget for next fiscal year, that will give us collectively a chance to be able to utilize additional revenue. Underspending does happen throughout the year. And so while I can't speak to the specifics of the Anacostia example, I certainly know, looking across multiple agencies, there are 2 main drivers of underspending in agencies, if I could generalize it. One is during the pandemic, some agencies just saw a less demand for services that resulted in spending less. Other agencies, and this is pretty across the board, have experienced unusually high turnover, which is something that nationally we are seeing a number of employees just leaving their job for different jobs, dropping out of the workforce. So we've had a much greater hiring demand and more vacancies created as a result of individuals reflecting during the pandemic and leaving employment, which is not unique to DC. So one of the challenges that we have that is a focus of my office is making sure we can hire quickly so we don't have tremendous underspending as a result of lingering vacancies.
Thank you. Help me understand this. There is a 15% fee for money going into Housing Production Trust Fund, correct?
Council member, I think what you're thinking of is that 15% of deed and recordation taxes are dedicated to the Housing Production Trust Fund every year.
I was trying to get clarity on that. DC's unemployment was down 6.6% as of September 2021, particularly in hospitality. Is there any vision on executive to help cushion the blow for what we experience in the city as far as the fall off in the hospitality in the district with some of this additional money?
It's a great question. So we're focused on stimulating demand, and part of that is making sure we bring people back into DC and make clear the district is open for our residents, our visitors, and our tourists. We also look throughout the economy, as we have since the pandemic began, for particularly vulnerable industries that are uniquely at risk. And we have throughout the past 2 years provided directed assistance to them to make sure they make it out the other end. And we'll continue to look at the different industries that are affected. And then third, making investments in allowing individuals to reskill and train so they can adapt their skills. And I think if you look at some of the significant investments we've had at Department of Employment Services and even the DCPS high school focus in trying to make sure we have residents who are able to take advantage of where demand is in the job market. So those are the 3 pillars of what we do.
Can you say specifically what that funding stream is and how has it been working? Because I haven't been hearing that on.
Well, we have throughout the pandemic used different funding sources, including contingency cash, to be able to support specific industries, restaurants, hospitalities, hotels, as examples, that we can make sure that the uniqueness of the pandemic is not the reason that they're unable to continue, that there is going to be an end to this, and they'll be here to continue their business when residents return.
And I also see that a lot of businesses are suffering due to the vaccine mandate as well. So I'm hearing a lot of grumbling from the restaurants about that as well. Are you guys hearing that?
I've heard it from event employers that rent out spaces for events, so hotels, banquet rooms, restaurants that have rooms that they may set aside and have reservations for large groups. And so I've heard that those establishments have seen business that they have had secured, walk and go to different jurisdictions. Is something we monitor closely, and certainly we hope the health conditions improve to the
I
point.
have a few seconds left.
Yeah, so it's something we look at and monitor closely.
Real quick, according to House Restructure Trust Fund Finance, they finance 10 projects that's supposed to secure 713 housing units. How are we ensuring that DC residents are benefiting from projects like this?
That's a great question, council member. So what we want to, usually when we are funding developments through the Housing Production Trust Fund, we are working with local providers that are, working with people in the district to make sure they know about the housing and get connected to the housing. What specific requirements there are for entry into each of these units, we'll get from DHCD and get back to you on.
Thank you, Councilmember. That's going to conclude the questions for this hearing. I don't think I said this at the beginning, but typically we have a record that is open for 2 weeks. And the record in this matter will close at 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 17th. So anyone who wishes to submit comments, I'm speaking of members of the public who may have been watching, have 2 weeks to do so for the record. I want to thank each of the witnesses, Mr. Lucas, who oversees the contract, and Mr. McConnell, who is the contract, and Fitzroy, who manages the money that's being audited by the contract, and Mr. Donahue, who spends the money that's being managed and then audited. I want to thank each of you. Yes, Councilmember Bonds.
Cameron, I just have one burning question regarding the pension fund.
Well, you're going to open the door to everybody else having one burning question.
All right, so I'll write my question then if you.
Well, seniority has its privileges, so quickly.
All right, thank you very, very much. To Dr. Lee, you mentioned restructured income tax, that you've done that, or you're working on that.
Yes.
If it's
no, we've done that. We restructured. It was the income tax bond that we restructured, and so we hold less reserve for each income tax bond issue because of that restructuring.
All right, well then I guess this question is not really germane. I wanted to inquire about whether or not we were giving attention to untaxing pension funds that many of our residents have, and that seems to be a big concern of theirs.
Yeah, that's not germane to this.
Yes, but I thought if it were, we put it on the record.
Yeah, no, we have GO bonds and income tax bonds, and the income tax bonds are secured by income tax revenues, and the GO bonds are secured by the general fund. And the income tax bond each has different reserve requirements. And I think
all right, thank
Dr.
you.
Lee's referring to.
Mr. Chairman, do we all get burning questions?
Thank you.
Councilmember Bonds had a sort of pleading look on her face, and I noted that she is the probably the senior member on the council. So
thank you.
So you're saying no?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to say no, very polite.
Okay.
I didn't have a second round of questions.
I understand, but I think this is the first time in my 8 years there's never been a second round of questions.
Nice try. Thank you, each of you, for your testimony. The record's open for 2 weeks. The time is 4:33 in the afternoon, and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.